Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go through each champ one by one. I'm gonna try to make it as quick as possible for each champ. And I'm going to go over the legendary card that I'm using right now, which legendary cards, in my opinion, are viable options, and we'll take a quick look at the deck. We'll just do the deck for the most viable option. Alright, starting with Androxus. Andro's the same as last week. Darkstalker is still the best option. Besides Darkstalker, both of these have potential. Headshot has potential against tanks especially, and on certain maps you could definitely pull this off. Godslayer a bit less so, but it could be an interesting build, especially if Darkstalker were to get nerfed. But for now, Darkstalker is the default choice on almost any map, almost any comp as well. As for the loadouts, same loadout as before: Abyss Walker 4, Sleight of Hand 3, Through the Warp 2, Seething Hatred 2, and Buying Time 1. Barrack, same as before. I think it's about 90% of the time you want to be taking Fortify for the barricade, and maybe about 10% of the time you can go with Architectonics. The times you want to use the turret build is if you're, like full turret build, is if you're playing with another tank, Makoa, maybe a Torvald, or maybe a Fernando. But again, like 90% of the time you're going to be playing with Fortify. I personally use this build. Healing Station 3, Forged Alloy 3, Foundation 3, that's kind of the core of the build. You have option though, if you have, say, a Ying healer, you could take away Healing Station, so you have it at level 2, put another level in Palisade or Foundation, but personally my general build is 3 in each of them, and then level 2 Palisade. As for Bomb King, he's kind of the same as before. Chain Reaction is still just bad in my opinion. I overestimated Demolition a little bit. I don't think it's a particularly viable option. It's not necessary. It's too easy to just avoid the Grumpy Bomb. The only option would be if you're playing against a Barrack on, say, Jaguar Falls, he puts down his barricade, you put out the Grumpy Bomb, but even then I wouldn't really say it's worth it. Accelerant's going to be a choice. Again, like, this is at like a 95% of the time maybe. With that, I use this deck. You have option to change out, say, Countdown for Jolt. That's definitely a viable option. I prefer playing without Jolt. That just comes down to personal preference. If you want to play with Jolt, that's perfectly fine too. I even have a build with Jolt just in case. You have the option to take away Backdraft and add more King's Court, but this is just my personal preference. Next up is Buck. Buck is still the same. Bounce House is 100% of the time. This is your option every single time. You shouldn't be playing without this. As for his build, this is my default build. You have the option to remove Leg Day, especially on smaller maps. Leg Day actually is surprisingly uninfluential, so having it at level 2, even level 1 in some cases, can be a perfectly fine option if you want to, say, get another point in Vigor, or if you want to go for a more net shot oriented build. That's perfectly fine. This is just my personal preference, and you can definitely mix up a bit with your Buck build. Seismic Wave is definitely 100% of the time you must have it. It's just Leg Day if you want Leg Day 4 if you want a lower level, and you can kind of customize the rest of your build to fit your playstyle. Cassie definitely is pretty much what I said. I guess the only thing would be Impulse is pretty much useless. I wouldn't recommend it. We're talking big game most of the time. Exaction is still a perfectly viable option though. If we're talking a team comp that doesn't have as many tanks, you can definitely pull off Exaction. It is still really good. But big game definitely against tank comps, and even against non-tank comps. If you're really good with the disengage, you should definitely take big game. The loadout, for me at least, this is still personal preference. If I'm using the big game build, which I would recommend most of the time, then I just use Territorial 4 and Incitement 4. You do have the option, if you want, to use Sky Warden, although that's not my preference. I think it's fine with just Territorial 4. You also have the option to switch out Somersault and get a higher level Lunge, or you can switch out Somersault to whatever you feel like you want. Drogos, I think all 3 of the options are perfectly viable. In most scenarios, you're going to want Worm Jets, but there's definitely potential for Fusillade. You can use this in quite a few scenarios, but Worm Jets is definitely the more active build where you're looking for targets, you're looking for aggression rather than sitting back in your main and just left click spamming. Combustible is an option, especially on maps with a lot of tight corners. Jaguar Falls, for instance, if you use combustible, the damage over time effect actually shows the damage through walls, so you're essentially giving yourself 1 or 2 seconds of vision if you hit your loogie on somebody. So it is an option, especially on a map like Jaguar Falls, where there's a lot of tight corners. It can be really helpful with that. But generally speaking, I would stick with these two. This is more of a situational pick. Fusillade, again, more against tanks. Potentially, if you're fighting against a lot of hyper carries that you know are going to chase you down, you have the option to pick this, depending on the map, and you can try to just one-shot them basically. Especially if you're looking to get a lot of salvo value as well. But Wormjet's definitely a perfectly fine option. All of these are options. It comes a lot down to personal preference and what you're planning on doing in the game where you pick it. Oh, and as for the build, this is the build I'm using with either of the, or actually this is my Wormjets build. I don't feel like the thrust is particularly good when you're using Wormjets. I don't use it very much, so I skip the Thrill of the Hunt. Instead, I just get Survival just for that time when you do need it. And then when I don't use Wormjets, I use Thrill of the Hunt 3 so that I can thrust more often, because it's more of an escapability then. But that's a little bit of personal preference. Generally speaking, it's just Masterful, Lung Capacity, and Propel that are core, and everything else is a bit more situational. Evie's still just Wormhole. Neither of these options are really good. If you're going to play Evie, you should play with the Wormhole card. As for build, it's pretty much the same as before. Evie's just generally weak right now, so I wouldn't recommend playing her too much. But if you do want to play her, then it's still the same as before. Use the Wormhole. Use essentially the same deck as before, just swapping out old Wormhole card with Cold-Blooded. Fernando has potential to use either Scorch or Aegis. Aegis is nice for the infinite shield or for buying time, but generally speaking, Fernando's a bit weaker right now. I would say if you want to experiment with playing Fernando, definitely try out the Scorch build. I think it's a bit underestimated right now, so trying that out with the normal old Fireball loadout could be pretty solid. If you want to use the Aegis, which is still a perfectly fine option, then just go with a more shield build. You can use a shield build, or you can use a more Fireball oriented build, just depending on your team comp and how you're going to play the Fernando. Grok is definitely, it's all about the Maelstrom. I think Totemic Ward is still okay. Wraith is still bad in my opinion. Totemic Ward is okay, and I think we might see some more of it in the upcoming tournaments. It's actually surprisingly good since it does also give 20% bonus healing. But Maelstrom in most cases is the way to go. With the Maelstrom, there's definitely been some changes here. Just going full out on the right click, it seems to be the way to go. You can potentially still get a Gale if you want, but I prefer getting Monolith. And sometimes I might even drop down Arc Lightning by 1 level to get Monolith 2. For instance, if I'm playing against Drogos, because then your totem actually out survives the Lugi, which is actually a big deal against Drogos, so keep that in mind. But generally speaking, you're going 100% into right click build. You have option between Lightning Rod or Conduit, depending if you want some extra healing, if you want, or you can get some movement speed. If you don't want either of these two, you could potentially go higher level of Monolith, or you can get Gale at a higher level, just to have a bit more totem survivability. Moving on to Grover. Grover is pretty much the same. Deep Roots is really the only option in my opinion. It's too good not to have compared to the other cards. I still definitely prefer the root build over anything else. You can potentially go with more healing oriented, more cooldown oriented builds, but I think you should just commit to the right click. If you're going to pick Grover, you should commit to the right click, commit to the root, and you should get chopped down 4. And then everything else is a bit of personal preference. I like using Verdant Expanse just so I have a little bit extra range, but it's mostly personal preference outside of chop down. Kinessa, I still think Eagle Eye is just the best option. Suppression doesn't seem to be nearly as viable as we thought it could be, although we also haven't really seen anyone try it out too much. But Eagle Eye is still the option because if you get that one lucky headshot, it can impact the game so much. I'm still using the same build, but you again, just like last time, you have the option to customize your build quite a lot on Kinessa. You don't even actually have to have Prodigy 4, you can drop it down to 3, even 2 if you're planning on being a bit less mobile. And you can switch out some of these cards for potentially more mine build oriented cards if you want. This is just my personal preference, but there are lots of potential Kinessa builds. Maeve, I still think is the same. I see no reason to pick either of these two cards. I think it's all in Rogue's Gambit. It's just the best option in my opinion. If anything, maybe you want to go CC immunity, but the problem with the CC immunity is that it just cleanses CC immunity. It doesn't make you CC immune. So if you're getting rooted or whatever, it will cleanse the CC. But if you pop the 9 lives, it won't make you CC immune afterwards. So you could pop 9 lives and then get rooted, and then you're just fucked. So I'd say go with Rogue's Gambit in 90% of the cases. I'm still using the same build. I use Walk It Off 4, Savagery 4, but this is a bit of personal preference. I just prefer to heal as much as possible when I can. Makoa, I still think it's the same. Half Shell potentially there's an option for it, but it would take a lot of teamwork and it would take a very specific strategy in my opinion to use Half Shell. I think you should get the damage on your pluck every single time. This is just, I think it's always the better option. As for loadouts, I've changed it a little bit. I have 2 loadouts now. It's pretty much the same. I just swapped out Crashing Wave with Barrier Reef instead, so that I can shield a little bit more often. And if I don't have, if I know that they have a lot of wreckers and I'm not going to be able to use my shield a lot, or if I have no one in particular that I want to be shielding, then you can drop it down a bit, and you can get Springtide at a higher level, maybe Crashing Wave. Just depends if they're picking up a lot of Cauterize or a lot of Wrecker. Snake definitely underestimated maybe the slow card a little bit. I don't know about picking up Okono's Wrath. It's still an ultimate card, so it's only really relevant when you're ulting somebody, which in my opinion is not a valuable card. If you're looking for a very specific dive comp, for instance, it could still be worth it. But generally speaking, I would use one of these two. The Gourd can be pretty obnoxious, so if you're playing against tanks, especially if you're looking at flanking tanks, like if you see a Makoa or a Fernando coming towards you, throw it on the Gourd and slow them a bit. It can be pretty helpful. I still definitely prefer the pocket healing. Right now in the tank meta, it's really valuable to be able to pocket heal your tank, and it helps a lot when they have, like, if we're talking Cauterize 2 and Cauterize 3, it actually helps quite a bit getting a little burst heal. I still use the same build though. If I'm playing with more carries, I'll use my Eerie Presence 4. If I'm playing with more tanks, I'll instead use Many Gourds 4. Pip, definitely overestimated Mega Potion a little bit. I don't think it's a particularly viable option. I think Catalyst just provides too much damage and it lets you get your ultimate much quicker. So I'd say Catalyst all the way pretty much. Acrobatics I still feel is completely useless, but Mega Potion still potentially there's some options for it if you're looking for a specific strategy with it. But I would say Catalyst in most situations. And with Catalyst, it's the same build as before. Get Gift Giver 4, Side Tanks 4, so you can heal other people and slow other people while still getting healed yourself. And then Smithereens 2, just so that you get some extra ammo every time you right click. Ruckus still has 2 potential options. I think Flux Generator seems to be the more viable one right now. Having that survivability is definitely valuable. But Aerial Assault is still possible depending on what tanks you have and what tanks they have. Also depends a little bit on the map. If we're talking a map like Frog Isle or Serpent Beach, there's still potential for Aerial Assault if you have another tank to go with it. But if you're the tank that's going to be focused more on standing on point, then I would say definitely pick up Flux Generator. I have the same build for both of these. The only difference is I have fuel reserves if I'm going with the dash build. If I'm going with the damage reduction build, then I'll get Metal March instead at level 3. Shaolin, in my opinion, is exactly the same. Recurve is still the best option. With Recurve, I use the same build. I use Wanderlust 3, Swagger 4, and Grounded 3. This is just personal preference a lot. Shaolin definitely has a lot of viable builds, and you can choose whatever you want, whatever fits your personal preference. You have option to pick Desert Shadow. I've tested it out a little bit. It seems like an interesting card. So if you're willing to put some time into it and try it out, then I definitely say go for it. I don't think it's the most viable option, but in some scenarios it could definitely be pretty good. And with that, I might recommend picking up Mirage 4 and run like the Wind 4. I had a lot of fun playing with this build, just using my F as a movement speed bonus, basically staying in stealth for as long as possible and catching people off guard. You can definitely do that if you're more oriented at getting right click stuns and picking people off rather than just general damage. Sky is not particularly valuable. I'd still say it's preparation for the most part. Surprise attack still doesn't apply on anything other than hidden, so I don't think it's a particularly valuable option. Debilitate might be an option if you're focusing entirely on tanks, but even then I'd say preparation, because that just means more right clicks, more HP damage on the tanks. As for loadouts, it's kind of personal preference. I like to use Victory Rush. I just enjoy using it, so it's just personal preference mostly. Torvald, I still think is the same. Field Study is the best option for sure. The Runic Blast might have some potential, but I definitely prefer Field Study. I think it's just the better option. That means you can be more aggressive with your shielding as well. And as for the loadouts, I've changed my loadout a little bit. I still have Time Shipper 4, and I just get Eldritch Speed to have a bit more survivability, and then Conduction 3 as well to have a bit more survivability. But you can still definitely use Scribe's Wit if you feel like you're going to get a lot of silence value. Tyra's going to be changed pretty soon. Mercy Kill seems to be pretty solid. First Blood is a bit meh. It might be a bit better in the upcoming patch with 30% lifesteal. Hunting Party is still a valuable option, I guess, but it seems like the way that Tyras have been picked and played, Mercy Kill is the better option. As for builds, I still prefer the movement speed build, but there's definitely option to get more firebomb oriented builds in the way she's played right now against the tanks. That would just be personal preference and whatever kind of trial and error, what you feel works for you. I still prefer the movement speed so that I can survive a bit longer. And then Victor, I think Gunnery is the best option. Firefight might be okay in some scenarios, but generally speaking, you're going to want to pick up Gunnery. Cardio seems a bit meh. You shouldn't be running from the fights too much anyways. I think overall Gunnery is the best option. That long range poke is pretty valuable compared to Firefight. With that, I still use my same build. I still use Flatjack 2 and Predator. If you want to use Grenadier, then go for it. You can definitely fit that into your build. That's just personal preference. I've been testing a little bit with the Grenadier and still having Predator, and it works just fine. That would just be, you're just sacrificing your HP basically if you want to do that. But perfectly fine option, just depends on what team comp you're playing against and how you choose to play it.
Ying.
And then Ying is still the same. Lifelike is the one option right now. In OB45 it's going to be nerfed, and then we might see potential for Resonance or Focusing Lens. But right now Lifelike's definitely the better option still. I still use my same build. I have one with Mesmerism 2, Squadron 4 and Carry On 3. But you definitely have option, if you're on a smaller map and don't need Mesmerism, you can use a higher level of Carry On and then just get Spring Forward 1 instead. And that's that.